Grazing Service and the General Land Office was not without its problems. Conflicting philosophies of stewardship and land disposal caused many sparks to fly. Also, many of the old General Land Office employees jealously guarded their knowledge as job security.
So here you have on one hand people who still want to convey land and feel that is still a mandate. There's 3,000 plus disposal laws on the books yet, and you have the Grazing Service employees who come along on the other hand who are looking at the actual management of the soil, vegetation, resources out there on the ground, and they're going to clash. Well, I think you could call that a shotgun wedding.
The old Taylor Grazing Act had some requirements, but in trying to balance those requirements into the single uses that we also had mandate, it became very difficult for the field manager to actually balance those uses and have a legal basis for balancing the uses.
It took the focus of the environmental movement of the 60s to bring attention to the dilemma faced by the orphan BLM, responsibility without authority.
Recreation was coming into the fore. Other uses of the land. We started practicing kind of a crude form of multiple use.
Early leadership came from BLM's second director. Marion Clausen was dedicated to stewardship of the public lands, as were those who immediately followed.
We had other resources that should be managed, and there should be some balanced use. And yet we had no charter, we had no legal right to do this. And many of the things that we did try were done in spite of the existing regulations and laws.
We saw the wildlife program created. We saw recreation created by the budget process, not by any enabling act, but through the budget process. Forestry got a shot in the arm. Realty programs were being decentralized out to the districts. It was a very exciting time.
Congress at this time saw the need to resolve the question of disposal of public lands. In 1964 came the Classification and Multiple Use Act. The act mandated the classification of public lands into categories for retention, disposal, and further study for the Public Land Law Review Commission. Although the law only had a 5-year lifespan, it did provide for multiple use management on the public lands. But in 1970, when it expired, BLM was left in the lurch.
It became evident to me that, one, we had a great role in the stewardship of our natural resources, but our pattern of ownership was so scattered, so broken, and we were concerned only with the surface management.
The 60s also launched us on the course of systematic land use planning, first for watersheds, then under planner Bob Jones, the Unit Resource Analysis Management Framework Plan, or MFP.
But unfortunately, that planning system was almost entirely based on the surface pattern of ownership and the surface resources. In my opinion, we just completely disregarded the mineral resource.
Then, in 1969, at the end of a decade of growing awareness of environmental concerns in America, Congress passed the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. It was a broad law with no specific language that would single out the public lands, yet its impact on BLM would equal that of the Taylor Grazing Act.
BLM, I think, thought they were going to be able to go blissfully down the road, business as usual, but it's kind of like the shot that was heard around the world.
Really about the middle of the 70s, we suffered some serious reversals. I think the environmental movement started out pretty well, but because of the strengths and the powers they were able to develop and the influence they had on Congress, we started developing some excesses.
The first crack out of the box, BLM tackled the requirement that we do environmental impact statements on major actions by doing programmatic kinds of EISs on range, watershed, forestry, et cetera, et cetera. Coal must have had 3 or 4 programmatics tried. Because of the lack of detail in the law, what happened was very similar to the 1872 Mining Act. We ended up being litigated.
So we developed a setup where our decisions were driven by litigation. We were taken to court, and it was the lawyers and the judges who were making our professional decisions.
In the early years under NEPA, the Bureau found itself in an untenable position. In many cases, an environmental impact statement might point to an environmentally preferred course of action for which the Bureau had no authority to take. We were not legally a multiple-use agency. We had the accountability, but we lacked the authority to take action.
We had some really tough impacts on people because we did bring people together for 6 weeks details, which went on and on and on beyond 6 weeks. It was really tough on people and families. We rode them hard and put them up wet, as the saying goes. But I think that the upshot of the National Environmental Policy Act, the one that really put her back to the wall was the lawsuit that was initiated by the Natural Resources Defense Council on the grazing program. NRDC challenged the programmatic, and the upshot was that the courts ordered us to do 212 EISs on fairly large tracts of public lands.
The NRDC suit had the Bureau in a quandary. First efforts at site-specific environmental assessment of individual allotments bogged down. Inventory data was backlogged at our computers.
So the upshot was that EIS ends up being a new adjudication.
While regional EISs were being developed, the BLM was sued by livestock grazing interests. An injunction prevented our making full force and effect cuts in grazing use.
We have an intermingled land pattern. It's pretty hard to order somebody off of our land, and it's not even fenced, and his is there.
A compromise position was struck to no one's satisfaction. Range conditions and trend would be monitored for a period extending to 5 years following completion of the EIS. Our critics took a hide-and-watch position. The coal resource program was subjected to similar pressures and excesses. Shifting signals in the area of NEPA compliance were complicated by radical fluctuations in supply and demand in the energy industry. Policy changed almost overnight, and litigation was commonplace.
We're getting beat around the head and the shoulders for things that we knew were correct. We knew we should be doing them, but we really didn't have the authorization except an annual budget that appropriated money to do watershed things, wildlife things, as well as grazing, which was really the main mandate, that in the forestry program.